Hi, this is Leslie with Silver Lining Knitting. This fourth video in my series on loom knitting a poncho is one that you can skip if you're anxious to start knitting. Choose a panel size from the page I mentioned in the last video. I'm also linking it below. And go ahead and get started. But it may not turn out quite the way you expect. So if you want to avoid experimenting with panel size and you're not intimidated by a bit of math, this video will help you take some measurements and plan the size of your panels. Let me begin by explaining how the panels would be put together and some of the important numbers we'll be looking at in planning our panel size. So here are your two rectangular panels. The width is the shorter side of the rectangle. That is determined by how many stitches in your row because you're knitting back and forth this way. The length is the longer side. That's determined by how many rows you knit. It's also important to know the difference between the length and the width. As we put the garment together, you'll see where that measurement comes into planning. And then once we put it together, we'll look for this front measurement, which is from the shoulder down to the front point of the poncho. So you'll start by making a seam and sewing your two pieces together in this L shape. So this is where the seam would be. Then what you'll do is take the one piece and fold it around, and then you'll sew, basically making another L, but you've folded the pieces around. So you can see that when you put it together, there's your neckline, and it is this difference between the length and width and this difference. So that's an important number to remember. And once you put the garment on, this is where the neckline will hit the shoulder. So we'll look for this measurement here. Now I want to show you a mistake that I made. This is probably the first poncho I ever made, I believe, and the neckline is much too big. It tends to fall off the shoulder. I made a little triangle of woven material to put in here and help, but it's still pretty big. And after this one, I learned to keep my neckline smaller. The way you do that is make less of a difference between the length and the width. If it's not wide enough and it's too long, you're going to get a really big neckline. This is one of my more recent ponchos, and you can see that the neckline is considerably smaller, although I've made them even smaller than this. This is probably about as big a neckline as I would make now. And I wanted you to see how it's put together and where these measurements happen. So we have one panel that comes up over this shoulder, and here's the seam. So this is the width of that panel and the length of this panel. And then in the back, we have the other seam going this way, and our second panel going over that shoulder. So when you are calculating your neckline, it's actually 2 times the difference between length and width. So here's that section on one panel and then that section on another panel. So you would take a tape measure and say put it around your neck or the neck of the person you're knitting for, and figure out about how big you want that neckline to be. This one is, I think, probably about 22 inches, maybe a little bit more. And then you cut that in half, and that's the distance, the difference between your length and width of your panels. You find the width of your panel by measuring from the shoulder, where the neckline is, down to the end of the poncho. And that would be where you want it to fall on your arm. So if I were measuring on my arm, I would say I want it, somewhere down to here, and I would measure to there, and that's would be the width of my panel. You want to make sure you're starting at a good spot on your shoulder. If you have a tight neckline, you're going to start really close to your shoulder. If you want a little bit looser neckline, give it an inch or two.
So those are the first two measurements that you'll take, neckline and width of panel. The last measurement that we'll look at a little bit is from the shoulder point down to the point of the poncho at the front. And that one's a little bit harder to figure out. There's some complicated math involved. I'll explain a little more about that later in the video, but those are the main measurements that we're concerned with right now.
Here's how to use those measurements to get your panel size. The neckline is twice the difference between panel length and width, so divide your neckline measurement by 2 to get difference, or D. The measurement from the shoulder down the arm is the panel width, or W. Length is just width plus difference. Pinning down the front measurement is a little trickier. I'll explain that harder math at the end of the video, but for now, keep this in mind. If your difference number is between about 9 and 12 inches, or 22 to 30 centimeters, and it's less than the panel width, that front measurement will be very close to your panel length, so you can skip the more complicated math. Here's an example to show you the math. I've measured and decided on a neckline of 22 inches. I've also measured from my shoulder down my arm and want a panel width of 21 inches. The difference between length and width should be half the neckline, which is 11 inches. And the length is the width plus the difference, 21 plus 11, or 32 inches. So my panels will be 21 inches wide and 32 inches long. I would calculate stitches per row using the gauge from my swatch and continue knitting rows until I get to the 32 inches of length, leaving about an inch or so for the final garter stitch border. If you want a very particular front measurement or a very small or large neckline and you like to play with numbers, here's the really mathy part of the process. Remember the Pythagorean theorem from algebra and geometry class? You can use that to calculate the distance from the shoulder to the front point of the poncho. The A side of the triangle is the width of the panel. The B side is the length minus half of the difference, and you're calculating the hypotenuse, or the C side. Here's an example calculation. A will be the width of the panels, which is 21 inches. B will be the length minus half of the difference, so 32 minus 5.5, which equals 26.5. So when we plug those into the formula, we get 21 squared plus 26.5 squared. Those numbers are 441 plus 702.25. So C squared will equal 1,143.25, and when you take the square root of that, you get 33.8 inches. In this case, the front measurement is very close to the panel length. Changing the neckline and panel width will affect the front measurement in different ways, and you can play around with those numbers to see what will happen. But since this is a poncho, you don't have to be that precise unless you have fun doing that kind of math. If you made it to the end of this video, you probably enjoy playing with numbers as much as I do. Thanks for hanging in there with me. The next video, which is the last in this series, will give you some tips for knitting the panels and demonstrate how to sew them together. Don't forget to comment with questions and feedback, like and share the video, and subscribe to my channel to get notified when I post something new.